gonna add this to it. Just before I forget.
Yes.
I was pretty worried. I brought our own like tinfoil and laundry detergent, and it's like completely said I didn't need to bring any of that stuff.
I love your shoes.
Thanks.
Hello. Good to see you. Can I give you a hug? I'm not sick. I'm just trying to not get. How's it all treating you? Good.
How's my placement? How's my placement? Is that fine?
Perfect. Yes. Car appointments, but I still have 2 left. Do you get study winter tires?
How about you?
I'm great. Yeah. But I'm yeah, awesome. Late congrats.
Oh, thank you.
So it's been like a while.
Yeah, but
I haven't
it
seen
still
you.
works.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how much of this was your artwork. It's beautiful.
You checked this out earlier. It looks
And I did find the picture plants, and
Yeah, usually I don't have artwork up here, but we had this little group show and
yeah, that's great.
curate myself into this.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I finally ordered cards of my artwork, which I had
Nice.
never done before. So that was
Nice.
fun. Yeah, so there's cards.
This is Avery. He also worked at the farm.
Oh hi, nice to meet you. Yeah, I don't think we overlapped.
This is Chelsea.
Or if you did, you were like 11. Where'd Pearl go off to? Do you two happen to know each other already? Very cool. So how far is your place from here?
15, 20.
What? Why did I think you were like not over here?
Right here? Yeah. I used to work at the school that's like 2 houses down.
No
Take the kids out
way.
on these trails
No
every day.
way.
Yeah.
Small world.
So, this is where it's at. Oh, music's fading out.
Uh-oh. You just restart that one. So do you want to give folks a few minutes to trickle in? Yeah.
So, did Aaron and his kids basically went home? Oh, we saw him downtown. These are all members. Yeah.
If you want to, you can erase the owls. They don't have to. They don't have to.
They're pretty good.
They are good, but you can erase them.
Yeah.
They're not mine. I think it was on a radio, but
Can't hurt the owls. And I don't think there's a lot of text in that corner, so I think that's okay.
They're on the street. And the week.
It's something else. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I took a number of pictures of them. Yeah. And it was easily the best in the show. Yeah. There was some interesting.
So do we do a 5:30 start, or do we have a grace period?
Yeah, close the door and that's it. Nobody comes out.
Bolt the doors. No one in or out.
People will leave. People come in late.
Should we set up any more chairs?
As of right now, I think we have enough, but
Cool.
if we see,
Yeah.
I'm sure Chelsea,
Yeah.
Terry,
You've got to bring something to entertain the
and based on the numbers that I see here, it's probably time.
Cool. Yeah.
Let's have the music. And he's like very outcast, super chill.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
You rented it, you took that,
All right, everybody. Welcome to North Branch Nature Center for the Visiting Teacher-Naturalist for the fall of 2025. It's only our third Visiting Teacher-Naturalist we've hosted so far, but it's a project that's moving forward, and hopefully many more in the future. Today we have Weeds into Wonders, sculpting with invasive species, with Justin Cifello, who comes from Buzzard Bay in Massachusetts, next to Cape Cod. And I'll leave you with him to explain a little bit about the project, his art, why, how, when, and all the W's.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this dreary night. I guess to get started, that first W would be whose. Let's go to that first slide. All right, who am I? That's me. You don't need that. I'm a picture right here. My name is Justin Cifello. He's already introduced me. I'm from Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, which is like the armpit. Oh, no, this is just for the recording. Can everybody hear me in the back? I can be louder. Okay, great. So yeah, I've been an organic farmer. I'm going into my 18th year at a lovely little historic farm in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts. We're like a mile from the canal. I've been an artist my whole life. I think everyone's born an artist, and a lot of people forget or lose track of that. But I've primarily did two-dimensional art my whole life, doodling, painting, colored pencils, all that. It really wasn't until like the last decade or so that I've really branched into sculpture. So this is somewhat new for me. I wasn't born a sculptor. Also a volunteer and a land steward at various conservation agencies in my area, write some articles for them, do trail clearing, and of course, pulling up invasive plants. And importantly, I'm not an expert. I'm just a nerd. I'm very enthusiastic about all of this. I have taken some botany courses and classes and read a lot, but if you know a scientist and they say something that contradicts anything I say, go with the scientist. They spent a lot more time thinking about all of this. So yeah, take some of the things I say with a grain of salt, but that is worth being said. So what are invasives? Could I get a show of hand for who has worked with invasive plants before, pulling them up? Great, seems like most people are fairly aware, so we can breeze through some of this. Basically, non-native species that cause harm. Very simple sentence, but we pretty much need to break down every one of those words to really explore. We have emerald ash borer, the lanternfly, and the multiflora rose. Beautiful, but actually, could we go back? Yeah. They're all really hard to identify. Like, we have very similar looking plants and animals here. This picture, just as a quick aside, next year when you have roses in your garden and you're trying to pull them up, the easiest trick is look for this little fringed stipule. It has all these tendrils reaching off of it. The native roses don't have that. They have a simple vase shape. All right, native plants. We have some Joe Pye weed, some goldenrod, and some wild cherry. So native plants, they've been documented to be here through historic records, through pollen cores from lake beds. A lot of research has gone into this, but the colonists, it's not like they were dutifully writing down every county that they found a Joe Pye weed plant in. So the records are imperfect. Also, we need to remember language has changed a lot in the last several hundred years. So when the colonists first came, they would write that they saw an elk when they met a moose, or vice versa. So the historic records get kind of complicated. And depending on the organization you're working with, you can find wildly different terms. And we'll get into that a little bit more. All right, the many benefits of native plants. Let's start with some food. Of course, these are plants that have evolved here in this part of the world over millions of years. And yes, we think they've learned how to eat this certain berry, but these relationships really go down to like the chemical level. They're very similar plants that you would think native animals would just start eating right away, but if they're chemically different, they will use those plants last. It takes a long time for animals to learn these sort of things. So many species of insects are obligate feeders. The most famous is probably the monarch butterfly and the milkweed plant. And it's really easy to think of plant foods as being the nectar and the berries and the leaves, but really these plants are making food in the form of insects. So insects are a huge driver of bird diversity and small mammals. So our sparrows and whatnot, they can't necessarily just eat a goldenrod stem because it's too fibrous for them. But if there's an insect like this gall maker there that's evolved to hack past the goldenrod's defenses, it can now turn that fibrous cellulose into a protein source, which is really crucial for migrating animals in particular. And then a variety of species. So it's not just that there are native plants, it's that there are thousands, maybe millions of native plants. So there's a patchwork, so there's food being provided at different times of year, different sorts of foods, different protein contents. So these animals need a varied diet just like we do. Can everybody read everything in the corner here? Okay, I would hate to erase the owl. All right, let me know if that becomes an issue. All right, habitat. Again, with habitat, we tend to think big, like forest, marshes, but what really drives the ecosystem are those like basal units of food. So the insects, and insect habitat is really small. So just having a variety of different shaped plants can really increase and change the biodiversity. One interesting example is with goldenrod and grasslands. If you just have grass, that's just one shape repeated a lot, right? So spiders can't really hide in the grass as well, but if you have a few different shrubs, a few different herbs, you have a different architecture, and that lets spiders thrive more. So then you'll have goldenrod, which means you have more spiders, which means you have less grasshoppers. So the grasshoppers aren't eating all of the young developing seedlings, so you can get these knock-on effects. And then basically the same thing with the root structures, but underground. We can't really see it. Where I come from on Cape Cod, it's a big sandbar, so erosion is pretty top of mind down there. And this is something we really see on the sand dunes. So everybody loves the rugosa rose. That's so prevalent, people think it's native, the beach rose, but it's not. It has a different root structure than all of the beach plums and dune grasses. So as this other plant pushes them out, even though it has flowers and fruits and leaves that large animals can eat, it's still undermining the ground itself. And then some species have really odd properties that we might not think of. So we can go to the next. Yeah. So that little plant, world loosestrife, it's in my garden. It's not the bad loosestrife. That one's purple. If you just saw that plant in your garden, you might not think that's a habitat plant because it's this big, it's gone in a season, what could live in it? But it allows bees to make a waterproof habitat so that they can overwinter. And also like all those little hollow stems that they're adapted for. And then tupelo trees are another tree in my area that are prone to having limbs break off, and they develop cavities. And without that specific tree having limbs break and having holes form inside of it, then wood duck nests are greatly diminished, and that's one of the primary reasons that wood duck boxes need to be installed by people. We need a variety of big trees because every different species dies in a different way, and having that diversity of different types of holes creates different sorts of dens. Complicating factors. So as we're getting into more complicated things, I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, you don't need to wait for the end. Please raise your hand and interrupt me. So with native plants, when we're at the nurseries trying to fill our gardens with native plants, it's really complicated. So a lot of plants will be called natives, but they're nativars, or they're a cultivar, which is sourced from a local species, but has been bred for ornamental value. So they might have less nectar, they might flower for a different amount of time. A lot of plants that are called doubled, where the flowers looks like they've been doubled. They're gorgeous to us, but they sometimes offer almost no wildlife value. So they're still gorgeous. It's still better to have a plant than no plant, and you obviously want to have a plant that doesn't escape, so nativars are good on that sense. But it is a little bit more complicated than a lot of the nurseries would have us believe at first glance. Some more complicating factors: near natives and adventive natives. So these are plants who are native to North America, and you'll often see these sold as a native plant. But North America is a big place. So something could be native to the Appalachians, and it could cause major issues here, like locust trees do. Or they might be fine here. So it really depends on the exact species. And with climate change and habitats changing, some of these are an asset too. Maybe a variety of goldenrod has never been documented in Massachusetts, but is from a place further south. And as the animals can move faster north against climate change, plants can't move nearly as fast. So we can establish beachheads for those populations. However, some of these adventive natives, they still spread. They're never as devastating as invasive plants because they're still part of the ecology here, but some of them do still warrant control. So it's really, this isn't a good guys, bad guys scenario. It's pretty nuanced. And so here's two different range maps for purple coneflower, echinacea, which is often sold as like one of the most classic native plants. And on this map, we can see it's marked as a little bit more native here, and here we see the purple saying it's less native. Some more complicating factors. Inconvenient plants. So just because a plant is native and feeds birds doesn't mean it's always the best thing for our yard. Of course, thorns and poison ivy are some of the first ones to come to mind. But we should remember, even if they're annoying for us, they can still be incredibly important for wildlife. Humans are one of the only animals that actually have an allergy to poison ivy, and it's a really incredible food source for animals, not for us, full disclosure. Vines get a lot of animosity towards them because they're seen as climbing up into the trees and pulling trees down. Most of our native vines don't tend to do that quite as badly because a lot of our native vines climb with little tendrils, so when they get the winter snow load that makes them heavy, the tendrils break off and the vine falls off the tree. A few of them do. We do have a native bittersweet. Grapes can certainly do a number on a tree, as can poison ivy, but dead trees are still really important. It's sad to see a whole forest die, but if we don't see individual trees die, then that's a habitat gap that's formed. Disturbance is a really important part of nature, and some of the disturbance that humanity has formed is actually preventing the good kind of micro-scattered disturbance that creates mosaic ecosystems. We want forest gaps. We want some places that are just a solid thicket of poison ivy. Now, pioneer species and weeds. They can be native or non-native. There's more on that on the next slide. Weeds. Very simply, any plant growing where you don't want it. That could be a tomato in your strawberry bed or a strawberry in your tomato bed. A lot of these are pioneer plants or early succession plants. So when that tree dies in a forest, you now have a canopy gap or a shade gap. So we have sunlight hitting the forest floor. There are all sorts of plants that are adapted specifically to fill that vacuum in. There we go. Nature abhors a vacuum, which I think originally is a paraphrase from Aristotle, but Thoreau repopularized that. Think of the bare places you see in nature. It's pretty much desert, beaches, mountaintops, places that get brutal weather. Pretty much anywhere else, nature fills that in with some sort of reparative growth. So nature abhors a vacuum. It wants to cover ground, keep it from being eroded away. So these pioneer species, they're nature's Band-Aid. They're covering things up. And over time, they'll give way. So pokeweed might fill in your yard and be a really annoying plant in your garden, and it can get a lot of animosity from homeowners, but given time in a natural system, even though it's aggressive, it's still not something we would consider invasive because it will phase itself out. However, human activities create constant places of disturbance, like parking lots, lawns. So we are pulling these weeds in. We're creating a niche for the weeds to fill. If we were to plant that with native plants, we might have less issues there, yeah?
At some point, could you talk about succession in, say, a patch of knotweed?
So knotweed's a good example because that's an incredibly invasive plant.
Understand.
So that's a non-native plant. We'll be getting to those, but those non-native plants, they create a break in that normal chain of succession, and they kind of lock it into that one
100
phase.
years from now, will there still be a patch of knotweed?
Talk to me in 100 years, I don't know. The non-native plants. Tomatoes, hostas here. Again, tomatoes are native to the Americas, but they're not native here. But most non-native plants stay put. They stay in the garden. Maybe you'll get a few volunteer tomatoes, but they're not going to replicate themselves in the landscape. And just a note on language, a lot of sources will call introduced plants or non-native plants alien species. Obviously, this is becoming politically loaded words, and I really want to reiterate that invasive plants aren't evil. They're not monsters. They're plants that got lost. They got moved around by humans. They're just doing what they're trying to do. So the vast majority of introduced plants don't spread. Most of the plants we grow are introduced, and they're not causing any issues. Naturalized plants. This is probably one of the fuzziest categories. So these are plants that have been introduced. They don't need human maintenance to persist in the landscape, but they could be either neutral, they could be beneficial, they could be invasive. So when you hear the word naturalized about a plant, you tend to need to dig a little bit more, but you can assume it means a non-native plant. And so as we have lost a lot of native species, some of these can actually serve as a replacement for some of those. Like I said earlier, nature abhors a vacuum, so it's better to have something than nothing in most cases, as long as that something isn't going to keep replicating itself. So here's two common garden weeds, Asiatic dayflower and mouse-eared chickweed, which might be pretty rampant and aggressive in your garden, but most databases don't qualify them as invasive. Here we go, invasive plants. Only 1% of non-native plants. So really, most of the plants you see in the garden center that are not native are not necessarily going to escape containment. But it does take time to tell. So talk to me in 100 years about if that Asiatic dayflower is an issue or not. So three big criteria. Non-native, we've covered that. Naturalized, we've covered that. They threaten plants and habitat. They cause ecosystem harm. But of course, this is an evolving designation. It takes us time to learn what these harms are. And there's a bit of back and forth. Some plants have received a lot of concern, like garlic mustard is a big one, but it seems like research is suggesting that actually garlic mustard might be phasing itself away. That when it's left to itself, it eventually gives up on a spot and is not quite as persistent as we thought. The Bradford pear or calorie pear has only been recently banned in many states, as recently as last year, even though this one has been known by a lot of people to be invasive for a long time. So we should keep in mind that this is a quasi-legal definition. So a conservation agency is going to have one version of invasive. A state is going to have another version of invasive. Usually those will be the same, but there are plenty of things people will consider invasive that you might still see in nurseries. So it's a complicated and evolving scenario. How did they get here? So for the most part, accidentally. Here's some examples. One thing that was a big surprise to me was ship's ballast. So during the colonial era, since the colonies were shipping out raw goods, weight, and often that was just soil. So they carted over tons of soil. Surprisingly, earthworms are invasive to most of New England, most of North America, and they most likely came over in ship's ballast. And then garden, industrial, agricultural escapes. These ones are pretty obvious. The pretty ornamentals like bittersweet that make the gorgeous berries, but they escape. Industry, there's an interesting one, the spongy moth, which used to be called the gypsy moth, but had its name changed for a variety of good reasons. That was to establish a silk industry, and it didn't work, but the moth persists. Intentional releases are a little less common, but they've still played a pretty big role. For erosion control, kudzu is a good example of this one in the south. Wildlife feed is part of conservation efforts, which is terribly ironic. You'll see often along the highways will be lined with autumn olive, at least in my area. Autumn olive was widely planted as deer food because, believe it or not, deer were almost hunted to extinction in most of New England. Again, hard to imagine now. Yes?
So if earthworms are invasive or were invasive, and gardeners love them in their garden, was there anything used before the earthworms?
So prior to colonial agriculture, the land here wasn't tilled aggressively. So indigenous agriculture would clear small areas, often with fire, and farm it for several years, maybe a decade, and move. So those little patches could regenerate. So the land had a thick layer of leaf duff. So there was a protective layer covering the ground of just decomposing leaves and sticks and stems and lichen. And that supported a rich fungal network. And fungus, of course, can forage nutrients and water much more effectively than plants can. So that agricultural system may have had a sort of self-fertilizing, self-tilling aspect because the ground was a lot softer. Some of the first colonial records about New England agriculture, they're not complaining about rocks, they're complaining about stumps. And it's not until they cleared the ground that rocks, I mean, it's always rocky here, there were always rocks, but when you clear the ground and the roots are no longer holding the soil together, you start to experience frost heave, and rocks actually migrate up. So the New England colonists thought that Satan was punishing for their sins by sending rocks up, and in a way, it was the result of their aggressive land clearing. It really can't be understated just how aggressive that land clearing was. Up to 95% of our forests were clear cut, and those trees were all holding the ground together, so that ground all slid. There was a massive erosion event, maybe on par with the Dust Bowl, that then filled in a lot of the wetlands. So earthworms are great in the garden because they're aerating, they're creating compost, but those are roles that were likely filled by other invertebrates, other bugs, and of course fungi. Cultural reasons. To make the New World feel like home, there was a group called the North American Acclimatization Society, where they were introducing species to improve our ecology, because in a way diversity is always a good thing, but they went a little too far with their goals, and they have established many species, mostly birds in the case of this group, and a love of Shakespeare. So this is a great anecdote, not entirely true, but I think it does, it's a good example of just the bizarre human cultural reasons that can drive some of these changes. So the myth is that this man, I think his name was Sheffield, loved Shakespeare and introduced the European starling there into Central Park. He did release hundreds of birds. It's debated about how much it was because of Shakespeare, but Shakespeare does write about the starling. So full disclosure, that is probably an incorrect nugget, but I think it really shows the wacky human reasons that we just can't predict. Sort of a cultural chaos theory. We don't know what will drive people to transport a various thing. And I like that example because it shows what one individual can do. Like another complicated example is the wonderful book about the lupin lady of Maine spreading lupins. She was spreading the non-native lupin, which does not feed the endangered Karner blue butterfly, I think it is. So a great effort, wonderful person, unfortunately a little misguided, and now there's an enormous legacy. All right, gardening is hard. How do these plants make it? So lack of predators, this is stuff you're probably familiar with. This is a big one. So when there are many invasive species apologists who think, or who will comment, like native plants get moved around by birds and wind and natural means. Why do these constitute their own category? And a lot of that is an issue of scale, that every one of these ships that was bringing over a ton of soil and a bunch of cows with seeds in their gut, and repeated distribution to like every port city on the East Coast. That's not something that happens in nature. Even when two continents collide, there's a great filter that slows the animals' movements across the landscape, so it can take animals millennia to recolonize or colonize new places. And then of course, the state of constant disturbance. All the construction, all the land clearing, all the agriculture, which farmer, I'm a little guilty of that too. And then of course, it's a domino effect. So once native plants and animals are threatened, we lose the mechanisms that ensure these kept going. So bears were almost hunted to extinction. Most of our large and even small mammals were extirpated or locally lost. And those each have their own mechanism of interacting with plants. So bears with their varied diet will range really far and scatter seeds. They eat all sorts of things and they deposit them in big piles of fertilizer. When you don't have bears moving them around, as the forest became fragmented, the plants lost a way to travel between forests. So ecosystem harm. It's pretty self-explanatory. Those big thickets preventing the native plants from getting in, and this is where we had mentioned succession. So you get the stands of knotweed that just are self-perpetuating. Sunlight can't get through, seedlings can't establish in the thick weed mat, so it's a halted state of succession. Monocultures, so putting all our eggs in one basket. So this is a big stand of Phragmites. Let's say there's a disease that manages to take out Phragmites, which would be good in the big sense, because then it wouldn't be as invasive, but now you'd have a sudden barren area. So having any area that's just one species is just a risky endeavor. Altered diet. So people will see birds and squirrels feeding on their invasive plants, and that's one of the biggest reasons I hear people contesting the need to remove invasives, because you can witness birds eating the berries. but you have to wonder, did that bird plan on eating that berry that time of year? Are all berries equal? No. So they want fatty berries at certain times of year. They need protein at certain times of year. So if a stand of forest edge that would normally be blueberry, viburnum, native rose, all sorts of like elderberry, those are all happening at different times. They all have different nutrient profiles. If that gets replaced entirely with bush honeysuckle, there's a lot of berries for 3 weeks, and then no berries. And then those berries can fill up a bird. They can be junk food for birds. So honeysuckle is the poster child of that. It can lead to nutrient starvation, where birds will feel full, but it's mostly water. They haven't adapted like birds in Eurasia to get all the nutrients out of this honeysuckle berry. So we had mentioned the roots and the stuff happening underground that we can't see. So a lot of some invasive plants are nitrogen fixers. They can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground, which is great in agriculture. It's one of the main sources of fertilizer for a lot of ecosystems, but not all ecosystems. So a lot of invasive plants can change the soil chemistry, and that can lead to runoff effects in waterways. So you don't want too much nitrogen getting into the waterways. Honey locust is an example of an invasive nitrogen fixer. There's that halted succession that you had mentioned. Erosion, like I had mentioned with the dunes. Choked waterways. So the aquatic invasives, which are ones I don't tend to deal with because working in the water is much more complicated physically and legally. But that's a major issue in a lot of waterways. And then, of course, they can host invasive insects and cause yet more forest issues. The big example of that right now is the spotted lanternfly, which likes to feed on tree of heaven. So they're unfortunate allies moving north. All right. So before we move into the sculpture aspect, does anybody have any thoughts about the previous topics? Yes.
A question exactly what we were talking about the nativars. Vermont Center for Eco Studies is doing an awesome study of nativars, like a community science project that I'm part of, and I think they're still taking people for next year, where they send you a native and a nativar to plant in your yard and count pollinators.
Oh, fantastic.
To trying to figure out like which nativars are
Oh, that's great.
okay and which are not. So I just thought that was.
Yeah, at the end I have a resource slide, so maybe we can sneak that onto there if people are interested in that. All right, so why sculpt with invasive plants? They're free. I think art should be accessible, and what could be more accessible than invasive plants? And a lot of the attributes that make them a pain to deal with make them pretty decent for sculpture. They can wrap around all sorts of things. They're pretty durable. Mitigation. So obviously we're pulling them out of the landscape. That's a good thing. And when you're out there in a park pulling invasives for a project, it starts all sorts of conversations, and just the piece as it is a conversation starter there. And it's an instant metaphor. Using natural materials, they're naturally evocative. And actually, could we go back to the last one? So part of what really drew me into sculpting and working with these plants was I had always drawn, and in addition to getting hand cramps, I just found the blank white page to be so paralyzing. So as an artist, it's really interesting and helpful to self-impose limits that force you to experiment. So the invasive plants, for all the interesting things that I just listed, they can also be really difficult to work with. It wants to bend this way, but you want your piece to go this way. So they collaborate with you. You need to work with them. So they can guide the shape of a piece in a way that I might not expect. And it's gets me out of that, like the artist version of writer's block, like staring at a blank white page can be kind of paralyzing. But once you have these, they naturally want to go one way or another, and you can just let them pick the direction the piece goes. Some caveats. This is the big one. We are playing with fire, so we need to be really careful about how we utilize these things, and in a lot of cases we need to decide it's inappropriate to use them. So some things we can do to get ahead of this is clip off seed clusters. We can harvest outside of the fruiting season. So most of my artwork I do in March because all these berries have had time to fall off. For the project here, we're clipping off the tops of the plants. Leave roots high and dry. Some people think that these plants are just invulnerable and can't be beat, but they're mortal. If you leave them up in the sun, they'll dry out for the most part. And then of course, don't transport them. And just in general, we're not supposed to transport wood long distances because it can be hosting invasive insects. So for this project, I didn't bring any material up because I didn't want to transport anything this far north. It's not typically as bad to bring stuff south. The concern tends to be moving woody matter north. And then of course there are plants that I just won't touch. I will not work with Japanese knotweed because it can regenerate from such small fragments. Some of the other plants I work with are still pretty vivacious. Like if you leave a bittersweet root or a honeysuckle root on the surface of wet ground, it can probably reroot for a few months, but they're never as strong. So when you come back again, you can pull them up, but I tend to put the roots up high in the structures. Some more caveats. So we don't want to make more vacuums. We have to be careful with how we harvest natives or harvest invasive species, otherwise we're just creating the same mechanisms that drew them in the first place. We have to make sure we're identifying things correctly and not getting so zealous in our harvesting that we accidentally yank up a blueberry bush because it's proximal to a honeysuckle. Even the weedy ones. So again, those weedy plants can still be beneficial. We have to think about what animals are using those. Even if honeysuckle is overall bad for birds, if it's the only bush in that area that's providing nesting habitat, maybe you leave that one honeysuckle. So for this project, we are clearing honeysuckle down towards the river, but we're leaving the last strip so that there's still habitat, and then hopefully native plants will fill in behind it, and then once it's established, that last strip can then go away. Some species just shouldn't be cut. Tree of heaven, Japanese knotweed, they need really specific guidelines for when you can cut them. Otherwise, they're like hydras. They respond like crazy. And then again, to minimize that vacuum and not call in more invasive plants into these disturbed areas, just cover the ground a bit. So today we pulled up honeysuckle and just kicked leaves over the exposed soil so that new seeds hopefully won't colonize that. And then, of course, it's an extra step, but ideally after pulling up these invasives, you would then recolonize that with native plants. But there are a lot in the seed bank, so they will hopefully just keep coming. I think I had already mentioned how pokeweed is often maligned, but it's a great plant. Some more caveats. All right, so these are more metaphorical caveats. So this can feel really depressing at times to think, I'm helping native plants, and I spend a day pulling up invasives, and then I look up and there's acres of invasives. But it's still doing something, right? So removal is a science. So if you're really trying to reduce an area, don't just go out there with a machete, look up your species, figure out when is the best time of year to cut it. And this is kind of a reminder that we're talking about sculpture building, not eradication, right? That might be an unreachable goal. Maybe these species are here to stay. That's my personal belief. And we're just trying to mitigate their effects, create refugia for native plants to survive this onslaught of invasives as hopefully local ecology learns how to finally eat them. So since eradication might be unreachable, target low-hanging fruit. So when I am harvesting invasives on the farm, instead of hitting that 300-foot solid thicket, I'll try to find a blueberry bush and clear everything around the blueberry bush. And then I find a viburnum and clear everything around the viburnum. So that's doing two things. Obviously, it's helping that plant, but it's also preventing that vacuum because now there's a plant there, creating shade, holding the soil together. That's more of the same. So something else we can do as part of this is report populations. There'll be resources on the last slide, but there are ways we can be engaging with them, and it's important to feel like you're part of something bigger with this, or it's just insurmountable. And every little bit helps. So anytime you pull up one single plant, then you've created at least that much hopeful native habitat. All right, let's meet some of our plants. So this is one of the most iconic invasives in the region, Oriental or roundleaf bittersweet. Pretty self-explanatory here. It climbs, but this climbs by wrapping, whereas, like I said, most of our native vines climb with little tendrils. So this causes more tree damage. So one of the ID features for these is they have alternate leaf arrangement. Could I get a show of hands for people who know what that means? Great, so about half of us. So when engaging with plant ID, pretty much the first place to start is leaf or branch arrangement. So plants, for the most part, either make leaves like this, alternate, or opposite. Not many plants do opposite. So if you find plants with symmetrical leaves, that's really narrows down what you're looking at. It gets a little more complicated when we look into compound leaves because they can look opposite and be alternate, but that's a really good place to start. So in all of these slides, the bottom green text will be the native lookalike. I don't think I've ever actually seen American bittersweet, but I've read a bit about it, and it seems fairly hard to tell apart except for when it has the berries. There are less berries because it's not invasive, and they're clustered at the ends. Invasive bittersweet got berries all over. Glossy buckthorn. So this one is known for its, can't quite see them in these pictures, but it's got these little lines all over it. It looks quite a bit like a black cherry. I think, Luis, I think you can just go through these ones so we can, read them all. Common names are a mess. Buckthorn does not actually have thorns. It's related to some other plants that have thorns. So when we're engaging in plant ID, we have to take common names with a heavy grain of salt. Cherry and buckthorn both smell foul when you scratch the bark. So that's a pretty good ID characteristic to get to those two. But cherries have serrated leaf edges, and you can see the smooth leaf edge on the buckthorn. Bush honeysuckle.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are lenticels horizontal or vertical?
Oh, they are horizontal. Thank you, that's a good question. Yeah, so they're little marks like this all over the plant.
If you take a knife and scrape buckthorn bark, it's bright yellow.
Yeah, that's another good ID. All right, bush honeysuckle. So this is the one we're primarily using. Typically it has yellow or white flowers, but we use this one to show you just how variable these plants are. And this is what we call a species complex. It's got friends. They've interbred with each other. They're really hard to tell apart from one another, but all the invasive ones, thankfully, differ from our Native American fly honeysuckle with these characteristics. So if you break open some of the stems, you'll find the invasive one has the brown hollow centers, a chambered pith, and the native one is solid and white. Burning bush. So this is, I think, the honeysuckle was also opposite, but there aren't too many of those, so that's a good indicator. So turns out when I made this slide, again, I'm from Massachusetts, which is a pretty different growing zone. Eastern Wahoo is not as native this far north. It's more of an Appalachian plant. It's not a super common one you're likely to encounter up here.
Can I just add something
Yes,
to that?
yes.
Did you go back to the Latin name? Because this is the way I remember it. One of my friends said, this is a plant you want to miss, you want to miss it.
Yeah, there are, I think the eastern spindle tree or the eastern wahoo, I think is the only native euonymus. And it, also called spindle tree, but again, not super common up here, so you don't need to be too concerned with misidentifying this one. It's got that striking color, and it has these wings along its bark. Grapes. So we'll probably be using some grapes in our piece because it's really handy, but grapes are a native plant. But they are very vigorous, so they do often still need some control, especially for people who are establishing orchards or if you're trying to keep your fence from falling over. So that's something that we'll occasionally cull and use in these sculptures, but with the native plants I use, I'm not going at them with the same vigor. I'm not trying to remove them, so when I harvest them, I'll take the offending vine and I'll leave the organism itself, and sometimes I'll try to tell it to go somewhere else, wrap it around another tree that I'm not trying to grow. And then white pines. So this is a native plant, excellent tree. It's our tallest historic tree in New England, but it is very overpopulated. So when they're young, they have really thin bark. So the indigenous fire culture was like a huge generative force in our ecosystems. I think maybe even more so in my part of the region. So we had fires moving through the landscape, creating that mosaic ecosystem. But a lot of those thin-barked species have been protected by human fire suppression, so they are way overabundant. When agriculture moved west after field abandonment and the railroads opened up access to new markets, and the sheep boom ended and people started growing sheep out west, huge areas of New England were abandoned just at once. And so that's not how succession tends to occur in nature. It wasn't a patchwork. Some of the biggest trees around were white pines because the colonists were forbidden from cutting them. They were marked as the king's broad arrow. The king had sole ownership of all pines, I think over a foot or over 2 feet wide. So there were large pines around that had been protected by that, even though that was 100 years or so after the Revolution. So they were there to fill all of those abandoned fields with white pine seeds. So now you get these monocultures of white pines that probably never occurred in the before times. So we get incredible fire load. So those little pines, they outcompete each other and they die in a level stand, so fire can migrate up into the canopy in a way it wouldn't in a more healthy forest. But again, they're a native species, so the goal isn't to remove them, but just to restore some balance. So we're going to be using quite a bit of pine in this project. Their meadow here, part of it is being over-colonized with the white pine, and they're suppressing other species. So we're going to thin them out, and we'll get more of a savanna. So there'll be a pine here with grassland and goldenrod in between. All right, so now let's look at some artwork. So this is how, before we get into the art part, any other questions on anything we've discussed yet? Cool, so what got me into thinking of these as a medium for construction was pulling them up out of all the abandoned fields that had been colonized on the farm and finding they were a big mess until you wrapped them into a bundle. And then they were a lot easier to move at once. And I was like, hey, these bundles look kind of cool. So thought they had some artistic potential there. And I started making things in 2 dimensions, making wreaths as Christmas presents, and this is just following the plant's inclination. So I'd get a straight plant and then a vine, and just let them like follow that plant's memory and make whatever shape that it would allow. So from there, branched out to 3 dimensions. And once I had a handle on how to make different structures, kind of combine some of those elements. So a simple globe in 3 dimensions, I could add 2-dimensional panels to it to create a little bit more features. These are pretty gestural materials. It's hard to get levels of detail, so I have to pick topics that can be evoked relatively simply without too much need for exquisite detail. So one of my first big projects was in New Bedford, made a series of invasive monsters. We'll talk a little bit more about monsters later. So the next big piece I did there was me and a bunch of family and friends made, like, I forget the numbers, maybe 200 little wreaths, and stitched them together in a honeycomb at this ecology conference. And we invited people to write down some of their takeaways. Some of them were inspiring, some of them were wolves, which I guess are also inspiring. And that project was then repurposed into this fence. So these are flexible materials. They can be taken down and reworked into different ways. So some of the odd ways they get transported. There's another piece in New Bedford of a big squid. This one had some fun dynamics where this is on a concrete pier. After the close of this show, one of the door guards came over and was telling me how excited she was to see all the birds come and pick away little sticks and carry them off to make nests. And at the end of the project, after I'd been out all summer, it had collected all these leaves and was actually starting to form soil. So like, succession was beginning to happen. So same ideas, but with different materials. This is agricultural waste product, drip tape project I did at the high school I went to, just showing how you can take some of these principles and use different mediums for them. So this is a little bit of how the process has worked for me. There'll be an art show. I'll submit a proposal, a drawing like this. And kind of just brainstorm by wrapping things together and making shapes. So this is the dragon that ended up turning into. This is in Provincetown, Mass, at a really interesting sculpture show where they turned a campground into a sculpture park, and each campsite was a different studio. So it got pretty big. So this is basically that same globe style, but just stretched out. And so this was modular. So I wouldn't have had the time to build it all there, so I built it in segments, stuffed them inside of each other, squished them together, unloaded them, and then stitched them together so they could form a whole, and using negative space to make it look a little bit bigger than it actually was. So here's some more 2-dimensional panels and some different ways of creating 2 dimensions. We have the honeycomb and the grid. Those are pretty much the 2 ways you can create tension. Yes?
How do you stitch things together? What do you use? Do you weave?
Yeah, I try to only use vines or only use plant matter so at the end of the project's life, it can just be composted. And we don't need to pull out fishing line or wire. So for the most part, it's just using the tension, the innate tension of these plants. So especially on the grid, once you have a handful, they hold their shape pretty well. And it depends on the plant you're using. So obviously I try to use straight things for this, and vines work better as honeycombs.
How long would they last, the structure?
If they're held up off the ground, they can last quite a bit. I think one of my dragons is going on 5 years now, and some of the globes in my house, and how long have we had those, Chris? Like 12 years, 13 years? They've been around a while. So some more 2 dimensions. So this was for a project, the prompt was freedom. So I tried to make a Liberty torch and a beacon. This is for a project on Cape.
Do animals get cogwheels?
No, I mean, they're not too different than the structures the animals migrate around, but they do love perching on them. I often have to watch where I put my hands because birds like perching on them. So here's some more monsters I made for a show in Eastham. And this is that torch from the previous one being repurposed as the head for this beast. And this is the last big piece I made in Truro. Again, worked with some volunteers. It's all together, it's, depending on how you count the negative space, is between 75 and 100 feet long and is like maybe yay high. And I created, so I mentioned it's hard to achieve detail with this materials. So I collected all the orange roots of the bittersweet to create the tongue and the eye, the white honeysuckle stems to create some contrast with the teeth.
How long does it take you to make something like that?
I wish I could tell you. I tend to pick away at these projects an hour or 2 here or there after work. So the first part is the harvesting and then the construction. And each piece unfolds a little bit differently depending on the art show. Here I was able to stay and spend the night a few times. So I would go and work like for the morning up to like maybe 2, and then I would spend the afternoon hiking as a reward to myself. So this probably took about a month of 1 or 2 days on the weekends, but half days. So about that. But I also had some volunteers helping with this. So it really depends on the exact project, how far away the materials are, how easy they are to harvest. All right. So monsters, why am I so obsessed with monsters? They're ancient symbols. We've always been really interested in them, and they're such an easy analog to map onto invasives. Our oldest statue in the world that we know of is actually this lion man here. So humans have always been interested in monsters and what they mean. So the sea serpent is a great cautionary tale. Hey kids, don't go play by the river. It's got a monster in it. Don't go swimming in Lake Champlain by yourself or Champ will get you. Monsters, we tend to think of monsters as horror movie villains, but in a lot of the oldest literature, they're often agents of the divine. They're created by the gods, often to protect certain places, keep humans away from certain places. And they're convenient for emotional development of heroes in all these old stories. And exploring the boundary between humanity and nature. This is something we've always been conflicted about as humans. And we tend to define monsters as something that is not quite an animal. We tend to think of them as a subset of animals, but they almost always have a human attribute to them. So I think they always represent this sort of schism. In one of humanity's oldest known works, the Epic of Gilgamesh, I was surprised reading that to find that Gilgamesh is actually the villain in the beginning, and he is tamed by the wild man in Enkidu that the gods create to answer the suffering people's prayer. And they become good friends, they go on a series of adventures, and they kill a monster named Humbaba, which you think is what a hero is supposed to do, right? But no, that monster was there to guard these holy cedars, so the gods got really mad at them about this. It was a monster they weren't supposed to kill. And they think there might be some historic nugget in there that Humbaba might have been a reference to the ancient elephants that lived in the Middle East. That were lost due to deforestation, and Gilgamesh was known as a great builder of walls. So he was harvesting all of these cedars, ruined this habitat. And at the end of his story, unlike most other heroes, he fails. He tries to get this herb of immortality, and it gets taken by a snake. We'll come back to that snake. So again, ancient symbols for all sorts of things. Monsters tend to exemplify like extreme human attributes, but stuffed onto an animal, right? They can explain all sorts of natural features. Why is the mountain shaped like that? Oh, it's because this monster hit its tail against it. And they get at this complicated aspect of the wild. We need these destructive forces. We need these rainstorms to irrigate our crops, but we need just the right amount of rain. It can very quickly become devastating. So dragons. I've always been drawing dragons, as far as I can remember. I was a dinosaur kid. Might not be a big surprise. And there's been a lot of talk lately in mythology communities, just noticing just how dragons are everywhere. All cultures have a dragon of some sort, right? It's really tempting to say they must have all been talking about dinosaurs. They must have all been talking about something that existed. But we should keep in mind that these are modern classifications. When we say a dragon, when we say a sea serpent, we have an image in mind. That wasn't necessarily true for the ancients. Like a lot of the ancient Greek dragons, they were just big snakes. So if you're telling a scary story in the old days and you needed to create a monster, the easiest way to make something different is to change its size. The first way to abstract something is through size. So you take a snake, they're a little scary, make a bigger one, it's even more scary, right? So there's a sort of D&D effect where people argue to no end about the difference between these different categories, but we should remember these are all modern interpretations. The ancient versions were all very different. So these are some of the competing symbology behind ancient dragons, and it seems to be most cultures who had them, they had one or the other or both. They're often associated with the image of the spiral, which could be order or could be a spiral into chaos. They're very often associated with water and rivers, and this is a myth that pursues to this day. Most of the people I mention snakes to say, ew, they're slimy. But snakes aren't slimy. They're not aquatic. They're not amphibians. Plenty of them live in the water, but they've often been associated with rivers. Rivers are both a source of life and a source of dangerous floods. And then the death and the rebirth. Obviously, snakes can be toxic, but they also shed their skin. There's so many myths where a snake is a healing agent for some hero. And in that story of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh finds the key to immortality and it gets eaten by a snake. Obviously, we have the Garden of Eden, snake compromising our immortality there. So we have these kind of dueling symbols. So it seems like in the eastern half of the world, dragons retained that life-giving force and were more symbols of luck. And in the west, they became more symbols of greed, that they didn't give the life, they took it, they hoarded it for themselves. And they're very often associated with ancient floods, even in very far-flung mythologies. So in the modern day, we're still clearly very obsessed with monsters. Always a new movie in the theaters out about monsters, and they're great creative outlets. It's a lot easier to draw a monster than it is to draw an actual realistic animal. That's why when you give kids some paper, they tend to make some pretty wacky monsters. It's a great imaginative force. For me, I actually credit monsters, particularly Pokemon, possibly as a gateway into naturalism, into simplified, dramatic categories that might be a little more appealing to kids than the nuances of a Virginia rose versus a Carolina rose. but it's still an introduction to these categories. Early monsters gave some understanding of extinction. If you look at the development of the unicorn over history, the Loch Ness Monster became really popular as people were discovering dinosaurs existed. And then in the modern day, obviously, they're great metaphors for modern concerns like the genetic engineering with Frankenstein or the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. And we're seeing more and more retold myths that are exploring these old stories as trying to understand cycles of violence. So understanding the Minotaur in the labyrinth, not just as an agent of evil, but as a victim in this greater scenario. And that's where I think they kind of tie back into the invasive plants, because these invasive plants aren't necessarily evil things trying to do violence into our landscape. They're the result of violence that humans are doing to the landscape. So if we can end these cycles, we can stop creating this niche that lets them flood in. And of course, the search for the mystery and the unknown. People want to believe in Nessie. We want to imagine there are unexplored places and that a large creature could still exist out there. That's not particularly something I believe in, but I think that the monster as a symbol for mystery is still quite important in our shrinking world. And here's some resources. So these are the two maps from our map slide. They're different databases, and for all of you starting to tackle invasive plants, probably the best local guide is the Vermont one. When using online resources to look up plants, you really need to find a local source. Do not ever trust the first hit on Google, because who knows what part of the world they are talking about. And that pretty much concludes my talk. Does anybody have any thoughts or yes?
I can't really see the end of the website there. What does that say?
Oh, it's vermontinvasive.org.
If you Google it, there, yeah, I mean, you find it really quick.
Yeah.
Vermont Invasive is really easy to find.
Thank you. Yeah, so we still have a little bit of time if there's any other discussion people want to have, any other thoughts for maybe your own projects or, yes?
I just wanted to add again from Chelsea, the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, that community science project is the native-ar study. So they'll give you a native plant and a native-ar, and then I guess you pay attention to who's visiting them. So there we go, perfect.
This is the Vermont Center.
Vermont Center for Eco Studies. And it's the native-ar study. They have other questions.
Another fantastic resource and a great way for you to help other scientists is the Teacher-Naturalist program. If you don't use that already, I cannot recommend it enough. You don't need to know anything about nature. In fact, it's better if you're just a good photographer. Basically, you take good pictures, plug them into the system, and scientists get to look at your pictures and say, hey, look, you noticed this rare elfin butterfly that hasn't been documented in your area. This has actually led to the rediscovery of various endangered plants in Vermont. I think there were 2 orchids last year, the year before, that were rediscovered that way. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you knew anyone else doing a similar thing with native plants and creating art out of them.
Yeah, there's quite a few different artists out there. Patrick Doherty is one. I think he's also called Vineworks. I think his materials might actually be grown for the purpose of it. But he makes really incredible, giant, like Seussical woven structures. I know there's a handful in New England, but I can't recommend his work enough. I got to...
Specifically with invasive zone.
No, I don't think so. But he's a great guy. I got to work with him on a project in Falmouth, and he was very encouraging. Yes?
Have you guys of how to, I don't know, not eradicate them from the landscape?
Yeah. Phragmites is a difficult one because they live exclusively in wetlands. So I haven't fully investigated the legality of working with them because removing wetland plants is difficult. And they're another one I'm not too certain on their mechanism of spread. So, I mean, they're clearly an excellent building medium. Like reeds have been used for thatched roofs. So I'm actually in talks right now with a gentleman in New York. So I might be doing something with Phragmites. So if anybody has information on Phragmites, please send it my way. I'm on the fence about if it's something I'm going to work with or not. Plenty of it in the area.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing here this week?
Oh, yes. So basically the dragon that we saw, depending on the amount of materials and how many folks brave the rain, will either be doing that simple wrapping and just making a bigger bundle in a series of hoops, or we'll make that cage structure, and that allows it to be a little bit bigger. It's not quite as strong, but and that can be a little bit harder to work with, but you can make something a lot larger with less materials. So the exact nature of the beast, as it were, will be determined tomorrow when we finish collecting our invasives. What's different about this project is you all are very lucky and have almost no bittersweet up here, which is usually my binding agent. So we'll be using the interlocking structure of having different species to hopefully capture that as well. So this will be mostly with white pine, which is really flexible, and with bush honeysuckle.
What kind of tools do you use?
Hands for the most part. No, we'll use, it depends on the thing I'm harvesting, but loppers, usually I have a big pair of loppers, a small pair of loppers in my back pocket, and if I can and if it makes sense in the location, I try to uproot things so that they're gone. But for this project, I didn't want to be creating open soil in all of these different places, and just as a matter of speed, it was easier for us just to cut things. So we're just using little hand saws and hand loppers. Oh yeah, the weed wrench. There is a really excellent tool for invasive removal. I should have gotten a picture of it. It's about yay high and it has a wrench mechanism on the bottom. You can hook it onto a plant and just use your body's weight, and it's really good at lifting things up out of the ground.
Honeysuckle?
It's pretty good at honeysuckle, yep. And with some of these plants that have thick root systems, you can use that to leverage them a little bit and then use your loppers to loosen up the roots and just work at it. And I find that when they resprout from the roots, they're never as strong and they're a lot easier to pull up the next year. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, the weed wrench is an awesome tool. I highly recommend it. What's that?
Where would you find that?
That I don't know. The farm just already had it. Could you look up a picture of the weed wrench? I think people might like seeing that.
I got a feeling that Vermont Center for Eco Studies has some.
I would imagine,
They have
yeah.
them up in the park here too.
Oh, great, yeah. They're incredibly useful. And they're great for pulling up stakes. They really save your back. I love working with them.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I think that one on the left is most similar to the one that I've used.
Oh, yeah.
The one I've used is a little bit different, but it has a sliding mechanism on the bottom that adjusts to the size and really lets you maximize your leverage. But even if you don't have one of those, just a broad tined pitchfork or even just a shovel, hit it around the base of the plant a few times, rock it back and forth, and you can use most plants' own leverage to uproot them. Yeah, that's for my tools. That tends to be just those few items.
We've actually had a lot of luck with buckthorn not using that because we created a perfect seed bed for all of the berries.
Yep.
But cutting it off about that high and putting a tin can on
Yeah.
or even a plastic bag, a heavy black
Yep.
plastic bag works really well.
And when we're harvesting invasives, keep in mind we can use the opposite of all of our healthy tree pruning skills. So if you want to prune a tree, you're supposed to leave a little collar. You don't want to strip the bark. You want it to be a nice clean cut. So when I'm harvesting invasives, I try to make it as messy as possible. Try to invite pathogens in, because hopefully over time the ecosystem will learn how to digest these new plants, and that's one way to create this exposure. I don't know how effective that is, but I can't imagine it hurts. They don't seem happy about it. In addition to putting a can over the top of some stump sprouting plants, you can also, after you cut it this way so that water can fall in and the growth rings can't reconnect with each other. And it might still send up sprouts from the side, but they'll never be as vigorous.
You know, in some ways, your work reminds me of creating hedges in England.
Yeah.
Which is purposeful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that, especially with these projects I've done in the city, just seeing how quickly birds and life responds to them. Like the grass underneath these pieces, it's almost always more vibrant because they collect a little bit of water and the rain and the dew and obviously bird droppings. Yeah, anything that you can create more surface area in nature tends to be appreciated. They're always full of all sorts of insects after a little while. Birds often nest in them too.
Just a question, show of hands, how many of you signed up for the workshop tomorrow? So a couple of you. Yeah, so you guys are going to have a chance to take ownership of that piece that will be built together in the next few days. And there's still some spots, if any of you are now, after the presentation, inspired to work with us starting tomorrow. I think there's like 3 or 4 spots left.
And really, you need no prior experience with art or working with invasives. And there's something that can be done for everybody. If your back isn't into bending over, yanking things up, we can find something for you to do. Just let us know. Anybody is welcome. Yes?
Is there a place where we can find your work or upcoming projects?
Oh, yeah. Not particularly well. No, I'm not. I'm more outside than inside. So I do have a website at Leaf Shaker Arts, and I have an Instagram page, also Leaf Shaker Arts, but they are not very well updated. But there are some pictures up there, and that is something I ought to be better at. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming out and for caring about native plants. It's appreciated.
Do you want any grapevines for tomorrow? I just pruned a bunch.
Yeah, that would be excellent. That would be excellent.
Drop them off here tomorrow.
Yeah, that would be much appreciated because vines are one of the missing things here because
They're at the top of my hemp tree now, and I just them were falling down. So
yeah, that'd be fantastic as long as there aren't any like bittersweet seeds lurking in there. Yeah, oh, that'd be great. It'd be great.
I had an arborist once cut the vine. I said, what do you do that for? I want that vine.
Yeah.